One, two, three. All living things require energy in order to survive and carry out their life processes, such as growth, reproduction, and further metabolism. This energy from the organism's ecosystem, pause, one, two, three. All living things require energy in order to survive and carry out their life processes, such as growth, reproduction, and for their metabolism. This energy comes from the organism's ecosystem, and in many cases from the food that the organism eats. But where did that energy in those food sources come from? For much of the life on Earth, the primary source of energy is the sun. Through photosynthesis, plants are able to capture energy from the sun and use that energy to power reactions that transform carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and sugar molecules. This process removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and provides the oxygen that we breathe. Organisms that are able to do photosynthesis are called autotrophs. Autotrophs are also known as primary producers, and they're a highly important source of food for other organisms. In the ocean, phytoplankton contributes 50% of the oxygen into our atmosphere. Some phytoplankton are bacteria and others are protists. Two important types of phytoplankton are diatoms and dinoflagellates. In coastal regions of the ocean, algae, such as kelps and rockweeds, and plants, such as seagrass, are important primary producers. Most autotrophs make their food by photosynthesis, but it's not the only way that they can make food. There are some autotrophs that make food by chemiosynthesis, and that's using chemical energy instead of light energy. Usually one or more carbon molecules from carbon dioxide or methane and some nutrients are combined into organic matter, using the oxidation of inorganic molecules like hydrogen gas, sulfide gas, or ammonia, sometimes methane, as a source of energy, rather than sunlight. In chemiosynthesis, in the presence of carbon dioxide and oxygen, carbohydrates can be produced, generally simple carbohydrates. Lots of the organisms that use chemiosynthesis are extremophiles. They live in really harsh conditions, such as in the absence of sunlight and in a wide array of water temperatures, sometimes even approaching the boiling point. Some live in deep ocean vents known as black smokers. Hydrogen sulfide comes out of those vents and are used by bacteria to make food. Then consumers depend on these bacteria to produce them food for things like giant tube worms. These organisms are known as chemioautotrophs. Notice that the input and output of photosynthesis are different, but they have the same purposes: to make carbohydrates. Photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and water, along with sunlight, to make glucose and oxygen, whereas chemiosynthesis also uses hydrogen sulfide or methane to compensate for the lack of sunlight. They still make a simple carbohydrate. For organisms that cannot make their own food, they have to eat to fulfill their energy requirements. These organisms are called heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are also called consumers because they must consume other organisms for energy and nutrients. Consumers obtain their energy in different ways. There are herbivores that feed on plants. In the ocean, an example of an herbivore would be a periwinkle grazing on some algae. There are carnivores that kill and eat other animals. In the ocean, of course, one of the greatest carnivores is the great white shark. There are scavengers and detritivores that feed on dead plants and animals, such as the hagfish feeding on a dead whale in the deep ocean. And omnivores feed on both plants and animals. The hawksbill sea turtle is an omnivore. It feeds on sea urchins, mollusks, crustaceans, but also algae. And then we have decomposers. They are generally bacteria that chemically break down organic matter. So now we're going to look at how energy and nutrients move through an ecological community. We're just going to look at a few who eats who relationships, and we're going to look at a food chain. A food chain is a linear sequence of organisms, and starting from the bottom, the producers, and it moves upward. At the base of the food chain is the primary producers. They are autotrophs and usually photosynthetic organisms like plants, algae. The organisms that eat the primary producers are called primary consumers. Primary consumers are usually herbivores or plant eaters. The organisms that eat the primary consumers are called secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are generally meat eaters, carnivores. The organisms that eat the secondary consumers are called tertiary consumers. These are carnivores eating carnivores, like an eagle or a big fish. Some food chains have additional levels, like quaternary consumers, carnivores that eat tertiary consumers. Organisms at the top of the food chain are called apex consumers. But in reality, ecosystems are really complicated, and they're much more complicated than a simple chain of feeding interactions. Lots of different species eat lots of different species. In the illustration, we can see an example of a food web and one of a food chain that is part of that food web. You may notice, however, that even the picture of the food web is incomplete, since only a small number of ocean species are represented. Ecological pyramids provide a visual picture on how the trophic levels in an ecosystem compare for a feature of interest, such as energy flow, biomass, or number of organisms. Each step of this food web chain or pyramid is called a trophic level. Primary producers are always the first trophic level and are represented at the bottom of an ecological pyramid. The diagram shows an example of a pyramid for the ocean. These pyramids can also show how much energy is available at each trophic level of a food web. The average amount of energy transferred from one level to the next is 10%. For example, 10% of the solar energy that's captured by phytoplankton gets passed on to zooplankton, their consumer. 10% of that energy, or 10% of 10%, which is 1%, gets passed on to the organism's secondary consumers, the ones that eat the zooplankton. With more trophic levels that exist between the primary producer and consumer, the smaller amount of energy that gets passed to the consumer. The shape of the pyramid reflects the idea that the amount of energy gets smaller as you move up the food chain. The visual shows how little energy gets passed along as you get higher in the food chain. Biomass is the amount of mass of living material present at any time, and it's generally expressed in grams per unit area or volume. These pyramids are showing the biomass in two different areas. We can see a biomass pyramid for Silver Springs ecosystem on the left. This pyramid is upright. However, the biomass pyramid on the right from a marine ecosystem in the English Channel is upside down or inverted. The inverted pyramid is possible because of the high turnover rate of phytoplankton. They get rapidly eaten by the primary consumer, the zooplankton, so their biomass at any point of time is small. However, they reproduce so fast that despite their low steady state of biomass, they have a high primary productivity that can support a large number of zooplankton. So I said the word productivity. Productivity is actually the rate at which energy is added to the body of organisms and biomass. Productivity can be defined at any trophic level or any group, and it takes the units of either energy or biomass. There are two basic types of productivity: gross and net. Primary productivity describes the production of chemical energy in organic compounds by producers. Primary are producers. The main source of the energy is sunlight, but sometimes it's driven by chemiosynthesis. Primary production can also be broken down into two types: GPP, or gross primary production, and that's the chemical energy that the producer creates at any length of time. And then the net production, NPP, is the amount of chemical energy that's not consumed by that organism. Secondary production describes the general biomass of heterotrophic consumers. So secondary is heterotrophic, primary is autotrophic. And secondary production can also be categorized to gross and net amounts of biomass. So let's illustrate the difference between gross primary production and net primary production. In gross primary production, we are looking at the amount of production, the amount of carbon made through photosynthesis. In net primary production, we're taking away all of the energy that's lost, that's not available to be eaten. So the energy that's being used by the plants to grow and to respire and to reproduce. The energy that's left over is called net primary production. Total net primary production on Earth is about 100 billion tons of carbon per year. It's a profound role in the global carbon cycle. A lot of people are surprised to learn that 30 to 50% of the production occurs in the ocean and is conducted by microscopic plants called phytoplankton. Productivity is very high in surface waters, the photic zone, because there's sunlight for photosynthesis. Then it decreases with depth until it gets to a compensation depth. The compensation depth occurs at the 1% light level. That's when productivity in the units of photosynthesis ends, because it no longer has the sun to drive the energy. In this picture, the colors correspond to the surface chlorophyll content. The red end of the spectrum is the highest productivity. The blue-violet end is the lowest. The overall pattern with latitude is visible. Low productivity in the tropics and subtropics. High productivity can occur at even some low levels. Shelf areas cover 15% of the ocean, but 50% of the ocean's productivity occurs there. And this is because nutrients recycle from the bottom in shallow well-mixed shelf waters. Remember, we called that upwelling. Nutrients run from the land. Light levels are the highest just off the coastline. Inshore tropical waters have productivity as much as 10 times higher than offshore because of the high nutrients and light. Upwelling zones bring the nutrient-rich deep water to the surface, fueling photosynthesis. There's great potential of upwelling due to a combination of high The colors in this picture correspond to the chlorophyll content. The red end of the spectrum is the highest productivity. The blue-violet end is the lowest productivity. The overall pattern with latitude is clearly visible. Low productivity in the tropics and subtropics. High productivity can even occur at low latitudes. Shelf areas cover about 15% of the area in the ocean, but 50% of the primary productivity occurs there. And this is because of upwelling, when nutrients recycle from the bottom in well-mixed shelf waters, nutrient runoff from land, and the light levels are just highest off the coastline. Long marine food chains that lead to consumers at higher trophic levels, such as tuna, utilize primary production hundreds of times less efficiently than a short marine food chain, such as those that support anchovies or sardines. Most fish production is equally divided between areas of upwelling and coastal waters. So the longer the food chain, the less energy is transferred, so fish populations are small. When we look at this chart, we can see that the efficiency, which means the amount of energy that is being passed between levels, is greatest in upwelling at 20%, but it only has 1 or 2 or 3 sometimes trophic levels, which means phytoplankton and herring or phytoplankton and anchovies. On the shelf, it's about 15% of energy that passes from level to level, and they generally have 3 trophic levels, usually phytoplankton, zooplankton, and then small fish. And then oceanic, which is a huge area, only has a food chain efficiency of about 10%. So 10% of the energy is passed from producers to consumers. They generally have trophic levels around 5, with apex consumers being at the top. This is where large fish are being harvested at the oceanic levels. The fewer the links, the few trophic levels. The more links, more trophic levels. This also means that energy is being decreased as the levels pause. One, two, three. So this illustration is here for 2 reasons. If there's few links in the chain, there's few trophic levels. So in the first, there are 4 trophic levels. If there's more links, there's more trophic levels. In the bottom, there are 5 trophic levels, which means that the fish have to be smaller in order to keep the energy that passes through each of the levels. The second reason that this illustration is here is I wanted to make sure that you understood that the arrows always point at what is eating. These arrows are not pointed in the right way. The reason for this is that the algae is not eating the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton is not being eaten by the algae. So the arrow always points to what is eating. The diagram now shows that the pause, 1, 2, 3. The diagram above shows how primary productivity, pause, 1, 2, 3. This diagram shows net and gross primary productivity. Net means the amount going in. So the amount going into the producer, pause, 1, 2, 3. This illustration shows that energy is never created or destroyed. Solar energy comes into the producer. The producer uses some of that solar energy for body activities and releases some as heat. So the energy that is passed along to the herbivore is the net primary productivity. Notice that there's heat lost in between. As the herbivore performs its daily activities, it loses heat. It'll pass about 10% of its energy on to the carnivores. which also use energy for body activities and heat. While there is energy being lost from the producer, the herbivore, and the carnivores, it is being gained by the system around it. This relationship is depicted in a trophic pyramid. The shape shows the loss of energy as you move upward. In the open ocean, only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level is transferred to the next trophic level. So in the first trophic level, we see that there's 1,000 grams of biomass, and those are phytoplankton. 10% of that is passed on to the zooplankton, or 100 grams. From that, the small fish that eat the zooplankton only get 10% of the 100 grams, or 10 grams. And then the big fish that eat the smaller fish get 1 gram. While energy is being lost, it is not being destroyed. It's simply just being created into a new way, usually heat. Areas of high productivity, high nutrients, and ample sunlight have less trophic levels. Therefore, less energy is lost and more energy is available to the next trophic level, which is a great fish catch. Upwelling areas, remember, have about 20% of energy transfer. Coastal areas have about 15% of energy transfer. And open oceans globally average about 10% of energy transfer. So if you look at the difference, upwelling has 2 levels in their pyramid, and they transfer 200 grams from the primary producers, whereas in the coastal, they only transfer 150 grams. And in the open ocean, the producers only pass 100 grams on to the herbivores. So why does this happen? Well, upwelling brings the large amount of nutrients to the surface, so producers are able to do more photosynthesis. It tends to make the producers larger in size. There are a few zooplankton, and it allows small fish to graze. In upwelling areas, most fish harvests are made at the second or third trophic level, and they are very small fish, such as anchovies. In coastal regions, there's sufficient nutrients from rivers and runoff to support a lot of different types of phytoplankton. However, they tend to be smaller than in the upwelling zones. There's a few added trophic levels, and the fish harvest is usually at the 4th level. Herring. Less energy is transferred because the efficiency is only about 15%. In the open ocean, phytoplankton is very small and spread out, so the herbivores are also small and spread out. Because the photic zone is only a small part of the ocean's productivity, the ocean's productivity spreads across a vast area. It's harder to find food sources, so fish and predators are spread out. It's inefficient to harvest fish at the 4th trophic level because they're smaller, further away, and spread out. So there is a 5th trophic level of large predators that are able to move large distances to find food. It is more efficient to harvest at the 5th trophic level, so we do fish catches open ocean at the 5th level. The big takeaway. Generally, primary production decreases with distance from land because, first of all, rivers are the primary suppliers of nutrients to marine systems. And 2, water depth increases with the distance offshore, making it less likely that essential nutrients are caught up in organic molecules and that they will sink below the photic zone and not be recycled.